Marcus Reed kept his hands in his coat pockets and watched the alley from the second-floor window like it was one of his many investments. Something to be monitored, something to be managed. The alley behind his townhouse was a thin strip of city that smelled of rain, old coffee, and the city's indifferent late-night breath. He hadn't meant to be looking down. He had come upstairs to escape a bored call that had run too long, to find a minute of quiet before the next barrage of emails. Instead, he saw movement, small, furtive, and oddly focused. He frowned. The figure in the alley wasn't an adult at all. It was a boy, thin and bundled against a March wind, a pair of hand-me-down sneakers too big at the toes. The boy's fingers rummaged through a tangle of paper and plastic with an almost careful aggression, as if there was an order to his motions that the trash ignored. Marcus's first reaction was irritation. Anyone could trespass. Then, because his housekeeper, Rosa, had been late the night before, a softer thought arrived. The boy's crouched posture, the way the shoulders trembled when he reached, the glint of something on his wrist. He found himself downstairs before he could make rationalizations about privacy and interference. He crossed the service yard and called down, "Hey, you okay down there?" The boy started, rising too quickly and knocking a lid against the metal. He swung around, breath caught beneath his ribs, eyes wide and wary. For a heartbeat, Marcus expected him to bolt. Then Marcus noticed the hospital bracelet wrapped around the boy's wrist. A cheap plastic band, frayed and scribbled with a name in a child's handwriting. The sight pulled something older than curiosity through Marcus. A thing like memory, dim and electric. "Don't be scared," Marcus said, softer than he'd planned. Are you Rose's?" The boy's shoulders dropped a fraction. "No, sir. I'm Jamal." The name was clipped and guarded. I live 2 blocks. I was looking for bottles." Come inside," Marcus said before his etiquette manual could protest. "Warm up. I'll get you something to eat." Inside, with the kettle hissing, Jamal sat at the small kitchen table, fingers tracing the edge of the hospital band. Marcus studied him. The smear of city dust along his cheek, a small scar under his lower lip, the way his hands trembled if he imagined someone watching. Marcus had watched people from windows his whole life. He could tell hunger at a glance. "How old are you?" Marcus asked, but Jamal only shrugged. 10, he said finally. The number slid out like something he'd practiced. Rosa appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her mouth opened at the sight of a strange child in the kitchen and then softened when she saw Jamal's face. "He's my neighbor's boy," Marcus said quickly. "Found him in the alley." Rosa's eyes flicked to Jamal's wrist. "Oh, Mijo," she murmured, the nickname a warmth in the cold kitchen. "They put that on at the hospital." "You were born at Central?" Jamal's fingers tightened on the bracelet. My mom said we had to throw things out if they were broken," he said finally. "She says you can't keep things if you can't afford them. I saw a little box in the trash and a picture was inside, so I kept it." Marcus remembered the box. He remembered in flashes the charity event, the small wooden keepsake his mother had insisted they bring, the way her hands had trembled when she clasped it. He had told himself the past was the past. But now, with a thin hospital bracelet and a boy with scuffed sneakers, the past knocked with the sound of a hand at the glass. "Where is the box?" Marcus asked. Jamal shuffled his feet and pointed to a sodden bag by the bin. "I brought it up with the bottles. I thought maybe someone would see it and take it back." They sifted through the garbage like people trying to find a promise they'd buried. The box was small and charred along one edge, its wood swollen from beer and rain. Inside was a photograph, edges yellowed. A snapshot of a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket, held by 2 hands too young to be steady. Tucked behind the photo was a folded scrap of paper, a name and a phone number, faint and shaky. Marcus's throat closed. He recognized the handwriting without wanting to, his mother's looping script, the way the R curled like a question. The slip read Evelyn Hart, March 27, 2000, Central General. The numbers on the back were APO, box downtown, an account reference Marcus remembered as a footnote in an old ledger he'd never opened. "This is my mother's handwriting," Marcus said, the sentence a whisper of ledger and late apologies. The photograph showed a baby with a little cleft in her chin that matched Jamal's face in some odd genetic echo. Marcus had long kept a ghost named Evelyn at arm's length, the missing baby from a scandal that had fed tabloids the year his family had quietly closed ranks. The bracelet had the name Evelyn Hart. The date fit the rumor. Rosa traced the letters with a fingertip. "We should call the police," she said, but her voice was cautious. "If it's the Evelyn Hart they mean, Detective Alvarez arrived with the muted authority of someone who had watched headlines become history many times over. He had been alive during the Evelyn Hart story years ago, Marcus had heard, and he carried the patience of a man who knew how long truth could take to surface. He took photographs, logged the bracelet, and asked gentle questions about Jamal's life and where he slept. Word moved faster than Marcus expected. A missing child case reopened by the discovery of physical evidence tied to a notorious old story was a scent in the city that drew attention. Reporters called within hours. A television van idled 2 streets over like an accusation. Social media churned with theories and old photographs, each click another voice in the growing chorus. "Keep this quiet," Marcus told the detective, but he knew the request was futile. The discovery had opened something that could not easily be closed. He had built a life on discretion, but discretion could not resurrect a past sealed in silence. Some investments are not about money, some are about repair. Detective Alvarez pulled old files, cross-referenced hospital logs, and requested access to the P.O. box scrawled on the scrap. The P.O. box was still active. The key payments had been traced to an account tied once to Marcus's mother. Inside the box were old letters, a faded map, and a note with an address to a shelter outside the city. Small things but enough to widen a net. The shelter produced an employee who remembered a tiny girl left in a quiet moment, a woman in a rush, and a man who'd asked that no names be taken. An adoption agency produced a photocopied certificate with signatures that matched a script Marcus had never hoped to see again. An old charity director admitted to helping obscure a name during a scandal that had threatened reputations and donations. As the investigation widened, the narrative shifted from ledger entries to people. A woman named Lillian Hart, a volunteer at the charity years ago, came forward with a voice that wavered between relief and apology. She described a frantic night when a newborn had been passed into someone's care with the promise of safety, how fear had made people make arrangements in halves and whispers. George Whitmore, an elderly gardener who had worked for the estate, provided a journal in which he had written about a baby he had once held and the hush that followed after he had been asked to keep quiet. The more the files were opened, the messier the truth. A lawyer who had been paid to secure silence confessed. A foster mother recalled the signed papers she'd been forced to sign without reading. The charity's records, once polished for donors, were frayed at the edges where decisions had been made hastily. Marcus felt the weight of his family's complicity as something physical, pressing in on him like a remembered scolding. Through it all, Jamal remained a small, steady point of normalcy. He helped Rosa fold laundry, watered plants that Marcus pretended he didn't like, and sometimes, when the evening news ran footage of the search, Jamal would press his forehead to the glass and whisper the name Evelyn like a prayer. He had not meant to change the course of people's lives, he had just kept a photograph. The community rallied and recoiled in turns. Volunteers scoured shelters and archives. Bloggers and local historians turned over old news clippings. The media's hunger meant that half-truths and wild guesses proliferated, but the detectives' interviews and the paper trail produced leads. A small-town hospital called with a quiet discovery after an elderly man died from a fall. In his coat lining, staff found another photograph, the same newborn, and a hospital bracelet. In his trunk lay a journal that told of nights when promises were made and kept in uneasy faith. When Marcus read George Whitmore's journal, he felt the family ledger refract into faces and faults. Whitmore had written about being handed a baby in a storm and being asked to hide her until things cooled. He had kept a distance for years, fearful of speaking up until age and conscience made the burden unbearable. His entries were not legal testimony, but they were human notes heavy with regret. As the search progressed, people were forced to reckon. The charity underwent inquiries. Some staff resigned. Others testified under oath about decisions made under coercion and fear. Marcus found himself in interviews he had once avoided, not shaping the narrative this time but offering facts and admissions. He opened what records he could and funded independent searches and support services. It was not enough to erase the past, but it was work that had to be done. For Jamal, life changed quietly. Offers of help came in from strangers who wanted to be the kind of hero the news cycle demanded. Marcus set up a small trust for his education and basic needs, not for show but because the boy deserved stability. Rosa insisted Jamal stay with her for the time being, and Marcus agreed, resisting the urge to fold everything into a spreadsheet and solve it with numbers. Months later, a lead from a 3-hour drive away produced a woman named Evelyn Hart living under another name. She had been adopted at a young age, her record sealed by agreements brokered in the confusion and fear of a scandal. She was now 34 with a life of work and children and rhythms that didn't include being called the missing baby by anchors. The reunion was not cinematic. It was awkward and human and full of small accommodations. Evelyn asked hard questions about why she had been hidden and what the adults around her had feared. She had memories that fit the fragments. A lullaby hummed from a stranger's mouth, a scar behind the ear that matched Whitmore's notes. She also had a life built on the idea that the past was closed. The first meetings with Marcus were halting. There were apologies on both sides, explanations that felt inadequate, and a cautious testing of new trust. Evelyn wanted nothing from Marcus but truth and a willingness from everyone to acknowledge harm and help mend what could be mended. The city watched the reunion, sometimes tender, sometimes merciless. Interviews must be negotiated carefully for the sake of Evelyn's privacy. Social workers and therapists helped map trauma into care. The legal inquiries continued, producing admissions and the odd arrest. Some people who had been complicit came forward. Others maintained they had acted to protect. The charity changed hands, restructured, and accepted oversight. Marcus donated funds for transparency, for records access, for counseling, not as penance but as a practical part of making amends. Evelyn and Marcus took long, careful steps toward an awkward kinship. They met in a park where pigeons pecked at dropped bread and children's laughter stitched open air. She showed him a cheap bracelet she had kept for years, a talisman from a childhood she had never meant to be defined by absence. He gave her a restored copy of the photograph found in the trash and read aloud from George Whitmore's tender, ashamed journal entries. Words did what paper could not. They bore witness. None of them pretended the story was clean. There were legal messes and lingering resentments and nights when Marcus would wake and hear his father's silence echoing like a threat. But there was also, for the first time, a willingness to face consequences and to do the slow work of repair. Jamal learned to sit in a classroom and read aloud without the pressure of needing to provide for himself. Rosa moved through the household with a satisfaction that was less about charity and more about righting a wrong. It began with a small boy's curiosity and a hospital band. That small, discarded object unraveled a long-held lie and set in motion a wide search that forced people to choose between silence and truth. The discovery did not fix everything. It opened years of complexity and grief. It also yielded a life and a quiet chorus of accountability, and for those closest to the center, it demanded an honesty that was long overdue. The city would tell variations of the story for months, but for Jamal, for Evelyn, and for Marcus, it became a reminder that the smallest found thing can change outcomes and that sometimes the messy human work of acknowledging harm is where real repair starts. The search expanded in ways Marcus had never